person this week, either here or on my Patreon. So, anyway, we're gonna get right into this case. I got most of this information from a true crime daily article, but I thought that you guys would still enjoy it. We're gonna talk about the murder of Molly Young today. She was the baby of the family, the third of three, but she is described as having a soul much older than her years. She loved music, art, literature, and she was very intellectual and articulate. Her sister Holly said she was a staunch nonconformist with the heart of an artist and the talent to back it up. Molly is my youngest daughter, my baby daughter. She liked photography, art, and she was very good at it, said Larry Young, her father. In high school, she even placed in a national photo competition, but behind the camera, Molly's life wasn't always so picture perfect. As a teen, she just struggled with bouts of depression, often writing about them in her journal. And then later, there was what her family describes as the scare. She had what she thought was cancer of her thyroid, and in some of the photographs of her, you can see the knot in her neck, and she got scared and depressed. She had surgery to remove this mass, and thankfully it was not cancer, but some of the people that describe her life around that time say there was a dangerous malignancy growing in Molly's life. Her boyfriend, a young Carbondale police dispatcher named Richie Minton. So they're in their early 20s, and most guys of Molly's age are not the most responsible. So when she first met him, her family was pretty excited about this guy. He's got a good job, and her sister Holly said when they first got together, I was actually happy for her. I was thrilled that she was with him. But Molly's dad had a much different first impression. He said that there was just something about Richie's smile. Larry said when it smiled, I just don't know if it was because his teeth were bad or just a feeling that I had that he was an evil person. Larry admits that it could have just been the overprotective father in him, but according to other people, there were plenty of tangible reasons to disapprove of their relationship. Molly's mother, Kathy, said, I knew he was manipulative because of the things that she told me. I knew that he put her down. Apparently, Molly had ended things with Richie several times, but Molly's mom said Richie knew just how to get her daughter back. I was over at her house one day, she said. Richie just texted me and said he's gonna kill himself if we don't get back together. Her mother told her, he's manipulating you. He's not going to kill himself. And Molly replied, but how can you be so sure, Mom? And it went back and forth like this between Molly and Richie for well over a year. Until one day, staying away became much more complicated. was not there. So she texted her, but Molly never responded. After several more texts that go unanswered, Kathy goes to the car and drives around town looking for her daughter, even circling what she believes is Richie Minton's apartment complex. Kathy couldn't find his apartment, so she turned around and headed home. It wasn't long after this, around 9:02 a.m., on March 24th to be exact, when Jackson County Police dispatchers receive a 911 call. The dispatcher says, "911, what's your emergency?" The person responds, "Hi, we have a person at my living facility who we believe is dead." This call is from a guy named Wes Romack, and he is Richie Minton's roommate. And the person that he believes to be dead is Molly Young. Richie takes the call over from here and he says, "It's my ex-girlfriend." The dispatcher asks, "Okay, is she not breathing at all?" Richie responds, "No, I woke up and she's covered in blood. She's overdosed. She bled out through her nose." Richie will later tell the police that he saw a pill bottle next to Molly's body, and this was the reason that he said that she had overdosed. He gets transferred back to a different dispatch center, and the dispatcher says, "I'm going to send an ambulance." And Richie recognizes the voice of this new dispatcher, and he says, "Amber?" And she says, "Yeah." And he says, "This is Richie, my girlfriend." Now, mind you, a second ago, she was his ex-girlfriend, but she just committed suicide. Can you send an ambulance here? Can you send a car over? "Yep, we'll be on our way," Amber replied. And he says, "Thanks, Amber." Molly Young, just 21 years old, had taken her own life, suicide by drug overdose, at least according to Richie. But just how accurate is this story? As it turns out, just 7 minutes after that first phone call, another one comes into the private line to dispute Richie Minton's account. And the person calling, plot twist, Richie Minton. Amber picks up the phone and says, "Carbondale Police." Richie said, "Hey, Amber." And she says, "Yeah." Richie says, "Hey, can you send the sergeant? She did an OD. I just found my gun laying underneath her." So, what really happened inside the bedroom of that apartment? We know there are two people in there. One of them is dead, and the other just gave a wildly different account of how she died the two times that he talked to someone. Former Carbondale, Illinois Police Chief Jody O'Quinn explains this discrepancy. The initial call came in as an overdose, and apparently then, as Richie went over to tend her to see if there was anything he could do, when he moved her, he noticed his handgun laying next to her, and that she had a head wound that was consistent with a gunshot wound. Okay, first of all, why didn't he try to tend to her before he called 911? Whatever. Carbondale police arrive at Richie Minton's apartment just minutes after that second call, but apparently the investigation, or at least an investigation, began much earlier that morning when Richie did not show up for his 7 a.m. shift as a Carbondale 911 operator. as I would think that there would be, and that's why I immediately told my deputy chief to secure the scene, not to let anyone in or out, and to call the police, the state police, to take over this investigation. But before the Illinois State Police arrive, Richie and his roommate Wes are taken to the station for questioning. It was basically, his story said, he'd gone out for the night before, he had been drinking, he'd thrown up on his own clothes, so he called his girlfriend Molly to help change his clothes. The time the phone records would later show was a little after 3 a.m. Richie goes on to tell the police that Molly had been abused as a child and she had tried to kill herself before, so as for when Molly actually shot herself, Richie doesn't know. When she came over, after they changed his clothes, he must have passed out because he was drunk and slept through it. Those were spontaneous statements made at the police station while they were waiting for the state police investigators to respond to conduct a formal interview. As it turns out, they're pretty much the only statements authorities will get from Richie. After these comments, he stopped talking. By the time the state police arrived, just after 10 a.m., Richie already had his parents and a lawyer present. And that's not all. He had 2 6-inch scratches on his side, and they were fresh. Molly's father, Larry, confirms this. From pictures, I assume. The scratches on Richie Minden's back, where did they come from? His statement was that he must have gotten them while he was giving her CPR. So you got scratches from a deceased person. Former sheriff, I can't remember, oh my gosh, Quinn says, I don't think he knows where they came from, because in my opinion, that was a ridiculous statement. My opinion too. State investigators seem to think that things were not really adding up either. In an email sent at 10:16 a.m., barely 1 hour after the 911 call, one sergeant writes, the death of the victim was initially believed to be suicide. However, when the questioned dispatcher suspiciously lawyered up, the incident is being investigated as a homicide. So, one has to ask, is Richie Minden a suspect? Initially, I would say he was a suspect, yes, said O'Quinn, but that was just the beginning. At this point, Molly Young's family don't even know that she's gone yet. Larry said, when I drove up in the afternoon, there was a state police car in the driveway, and the officer said, I regret to inform you that your daughter's been killed. Molly's mother said she just fell to the floor. After that, it was Kathy's job to tell the rest of the family that nothing would ever be the same again. Larry went to the police station and he asked to speak to the first responding officer, and he said, like an overprotective dad or any dad would, I want to know the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. And that's when Larry says a state lieutenant walked him outside and gave him the first hint that this would not be an open and shut case. The first thing he told me, this lieutenant said, father to father, Carbondale police botched this case. They let him wash his hands and change his clothes at the scene. According to Carbondale's own police records, responding officers did let Richie Minden go to the bathroom to clean up before they even took him to the station. And there's more. While police had not executed a search warrant on Richie's home, back at Molly's mom's house, Kathy Young said, we had 2 state troopers come to the house with my 80-year-old mother and handed her a search warrant to go into Molly's bedroom, get the computer and her camera. It was his findings as such. The investigation conducted by the agencies involved indicated a self-inflicted wound. The manner of death is classified as a suicide. I don't believe that for a second, said Larry Young. And just one day after police start investigating Molly's death as a homicide, the coroner changes it to a suicide. Her family said the cops had it right the first time. Kathy Young says, she was everything to me. I would have never left her in that room if, in my mind, I thought she was depressed or suicidal. So, what changed for investigators? Apparently, after seizing Molly's computer, they found multiple searches of the word suicide from the day before she died. Police also found Molly's journals with several references to her unhappiness with her life. And on top of that, there was a handwritten note found on the floor of her bedroom in which police say it spells everything out. It doesn't mention the word suicide, but it was a goodbye letter written a year prior, right after she had the cancer scare. And Larry said, I believe she thought she was gonna die of cancer. But then it wasn't just what the police collected in Molly's bedroom. The detective talked to Reggie Mitten about the scratches on his back. He said, what are those things from? Now, apparently Wes also had some scratches, and Wes said, oh well, I have a fairly physical job. Okay. Though Richie refused to give a statement to the police, his roommate Wes agreed to go on record. He said it's open knowledge that Molly had suicidal thoughts for quite some time. He said that he was friends with both Richie and Molly, and said he was at work the night before when everything happened. I worked until 5:30. My cell phone had died, so I plugged my cell phone in and checked my messages, and I'd had a few from Molly. Investigators believe those messages were sent just before she died. The detective says to Wes, she sent you a text about 4:40 in the morning. You're still at work, right? Do you remember what the text said? Wes responds, the last text that she sent me, all I remember was it said he'd been texting another girl. He asked Molly to stay the night, and then he was so drunk he couldn't walk. So she also apologized if I came home to anything dramatic. Actually, phone records revealed later on that the text said, I think I'm gonna shoot myself in the head. I'm really sorry if you come home to that. If I get a text like that, I for sure would have remembered what it said. A couple hours later, the detective says then, so about 7 or 7:30 you go to sleep. What's the next thing that happens after that? Wes says, I wake up to Richie opening my door and saying, Molly's dead, help me, I can't find my phone. Now Wes's comments plus that text seem to support the same conclusion that Richie reported in the beginning. But Molly's loved ones completely disagree, and her dad said that he can refute every piece of so-called evidence that these authorities have. So, how does Larry explain the suicidal text that Wes got the night that Molly died? He did it, Larry says, typed it in her phone. A text is not handwritten or fingerprints. My wife types half of my texts. Richie had her phone that morning. And he's not the only one saying Molly didn't send that text. As part of the Young family search for answers, Molly's father has assembled a committee of civilian investigators, including veteran police officer, a man named Charles Lamont. I was a policeman for the city of Mount Vernon for over 33 years. I retired as a captain, Lamont said. And he admits more than any other case he's ever worked, this one is personal. police seized Molly's computer the day she was found deceased, officers didn't collect Richie's until roughly 2 months later. 2 months. And when it comes to what the police found on Molly's computer, does he find it all suspicious that investigators say when they checked her computer there were very recent searches on how to kill yourself? He says no, it doesn't concern me at all. He says that's because of an interview with one of Molly's friends revealed that she was with him at a local club the night those searches were made. When they were at the concert, as the I speak English, really, approximate time those scratches appeared on searches appeared on her computer, but Molly didn't have her laptop with her. Lamont said, I'm simply stating she was at a concert when those searches were made on her computer. And then there's, of course, the physical evidence. Molly was shot in the top of the head, execution style, and on the left side of her head with what looked like her left hand, but Molly Young was right-handed. To top it all off, that's not all. There was no gunshot residue on Molly's hands, and her fingerprints were not on the gun. Now, to be fair, Richie Middens' hands also tested negative for gunshot residue, but remember, he got to wash up first. So, a lot has been made about the fact that Richie was permitted to change clothes and wash his hands. So, does former Carbondale Police Chief Jody O'Quinn find that inappropriate? I do not, says O'Quinn. The evidence that they would have obtained even from his filthy hands was not enough to prove whether or not he did the crime or not. So the hand-washing thing is really inconsequential. But what about basic crime scene protocol? Why didn't anyone bag his hands? I don't know why that didn't occur. No one told me they allowed him to wash his hands, said O'Quinn. Was there disciplinary action taken? No, there was no disciplinary action taken because no one would admit to me that they allowed him to wash his hands. Months after Molly Young's death is classified as a suicide, everything was set to change again. A couple of quotes from Molly's suicide letter. I've been alone a long time. Richie, all I ever wanted was to be with you. I'm sorry I made that so hard. Mom and Dad, I love you. It's not your fault. Those are just, like I said, a few of the lines from her note saying goodbye. Molly's family said the police have it all wrong. They found that note in her bedroom, not at the scene of the crime. And it never actually mentions suicide. And Larry says it was written months, almost a year before her actual death. And he knows this because one of her best friends read that note like 3 or 4 months before Molly's death. And that's just one of the many reasons he and others believe Molly's death is not a suicide. Another one. Richie says he slept through the gunshot that would have been within feet of him. Now, it does depend on the individual. Everyone does sleep differently. When a weapon is fired, it depends on how close it might be to the individual's skin as to whether or not it is muffled. So yeah, there are a lot of variables there, but is it something I think I would sleep through? No. Is it possible that someone who was blackout drunk would sleep through? Absolutely. So, if being passed out drunk is Richie Middens' story, but Molly Young's loved ones just don't believe it, what do they think happened the night that she died? Larry Young says, I believe he called her at 3 o'clock in the morning. I think he called her over and they got into a fight. Now, tests show his DNA was under her fingernails. There's also 2 other unknown DNA profiles under her fingernails. Larry says his roommate had scratches. I believe his roommate heard the fight, and his roommate came in to break it up. Now remember, the roommate West said he wasn't even at home at the time, that he was at work. I believe Richie Minton reached over and touched his side, saw the blood on the scratches, got angry, and shot her. Larry Young said he had many hours before he called 911 to come up with a plan to try to cover his tracks. Molly's uncle Charles Lamont, the former officer with over 30 years of experience, believes how much time Richie had to cover those tracks is reflected in the original 911 call. He said the call was staged. It was rehearsed. The tone of it is like a guy ordering pizza, not a guy who just lost his girlfriend who he claimed to love. Molly's father Larry agrees with this. That indicates she had been dead long enough. He had had time to calm down. And it also kind of proves he's a sociopath, because who would be calm in that situation? Unless you're a sociopath. And while Larry Young is no doctor, he does point to other disturbing clues to support his diagnosis. One going back to weeks before Molly died, the very day she and Richie found out she was pregnant. And there's a train. I'm so sorry if you can hear that. At 8:47, Richie posted on his Tumblr page, "Drops of lead are poured down upon her head until she's dead." That's a quote from the notorious Son of Sam killer. Larry believes that this is Richie threatening Molly. And in a surprise move, Larry, along with the rest of Molly's family, would get a chance to make that case. 10 months after Molly's death was ruled a suicide, a special coroner's inquest was convened to take another look. The coroner's jury was to find cause and manner of death only: accidental, criminal, or undetermined. As evidence supporting the original ruling, they provided what was the supposed suicide note, interviews with investigators, and her journals from 8 years prior. I can't imagine people reading my journals. The last entry in her journals was 9 months prior to her death. Allie Powell, her sister, said, "You can't base what happened to my sister that night on a journal she started when she was 16. I mean, to me, that's ludicrous." But they say that's pretty much how this inquest went. It was a sham, a total sham, and Charles Lamont, who acted as the family spokesperson, says they weren't even allowed to present any of their own findings, and they only got to ask a few questions. Charles Lamont asked the question about the Son of Sam quote that Richie had posted on his Tumblr, and if I had not asked that question and 2 or 3 others, the jury never would have heard that. But even with what was limited, as far as information was presented, the jury came back with a ruling of undetermined. Not enough to call her death a homicide, but more than enough to overturn the original ruling of suicide. And most importantly for Larry Young and his family, it leaves the door open for justice. So 10 months after her death was ruled a suicide, a coroner's jury changed it to undetermined. I've never had a case go from homicide to suicide to undetermined so quickly. But Molly's father Larry says there are a ton of evidence that they didn't see that would have changed that undetermined to homicide. 19 lab tests were done and they all disproved suicide. monetary and wrongful death. It was to get the information because I had no records. And they fought me every inch of the way. I didn't even have the 911 tape. Another thing he didn't have, his own daughter's cell phone records. And when he finally got them, what he discovered was huge. Someone deleted all the text messages off of her phone. There's not one text message on it from Richie Minden until March 9th. So from the 9th to the 23rd, they were all gone. Even though the two dated for over a year, but the police say the phone went straight into police custody, so who would have had access to it? Shortly after the coroner's inquest, police re-interview Wes, the roommate, and just like that, new information. Wes says, I got home, I looked through Richie's phone. When I arrived home, his phone was sitting in the common room, bathroom, and I knew he'd been drinking that night. So I looked through the phone to see, I guess, kind of where his night ended up. No, dude, you were nosy. But wait, in his original interview, Wes said that Richie couldn't find his phone and that they had to use his phone to call 911. And the detectives call him out on that. And he's like, oh, really? I said that? So the detective then says, did you delete anything off of his phone while you were looking through it? And Wes says, no. Now, Wes Romack has never been charged or even named as a person of interest in Molly Young's death. But Larry Young doesn't think he was responsible for tampering with Richie or Molly's phones. Anyway, he said that person is even closer to home than Richie's roommate. According to Larry, Richie's father is a forensic expert in computers that the state police go and analyze. They look at the computers for the deleted history. You know, they're the people that find the stuff that you delete, so people can't find it. Larry believes in the 4 hours between when Molly died and when 911 was called, Richie Jr. had plenty of time to have his dad come over and wipe their phones. Richie's father was questioned by the police and he denied having any involvement. In addition, the police reports say the parents weren't even notified until after Richie got out of the station. But there were rumors of other people at the house that morning. Some people in the apartment were not interviewed. They reported that the Carbondale police were on the scene in the neighborhood at 7 a.m. But the 911 call wasn't made until after 9 a.m. Lamont said, I don't know how they did it, or if we had an employee, a police officer, or dispatcher that did not show up for work and we couldn't get a hold of them. Somebody would have been sent to check on them. Now, if that's the case, and they had done that, they stumbled across a crime scene much earlier than reported. When they asked former Carbondale Police Chief Jody O'Quinn how it worked in Carbondale, she said, I wouldn't send anybody in this particular incident because we were told that the contact was made with him. He was going to come in, but he was just going to be a bit late because he overslept. Now hold up. Earlier, Jody O'Quinn had told them that Richie didn't even wake up until just before the 911 call, 2 hours after his 7 a.m. shift. If he's awake enough to tell the Carbondale Police Department that he's going to be late, but he hasn't called 911 to report a dead woman in his bedroom, what happened there? That's a good question, says O'Quinn. It's very odd, yes. But what do you think of it? Well, I don't know, says O'Quinn. Now, to be fair, Jody O'Quinn no longer works for the Carbondale Police Department. And then again, neither does Richie Minden. After 2 arrests for 2 separate DUIs, Minden left and now works for the St. Louis Fire Department. So, Richie declined to give a statement and said he didn't have an attorney and hung up when True Crime Daily tried to talk to him. As for Larry Young's wrongful death suit, it took him so long to get police records. By the time he filed, the statute of limitations had run out. So he appealed to another authority, Illinois State Representative Terry Bryant. She said, mostly out of frustration because he hadn't been able to get any other legislator to listen to him. After that meeting, the group called Molly's Law, which requires agencies to turn over documents requested through the Freedom of Information Act within 30 days or face stiff penalties. It makes the statute of limitations 5 years rather than 2, is the second component of this law. The law passed, and unfortunately it won't do anything to help the man who pushed for it. Larry was asked, is it bittersweet for you to have a law named after your daughter, but it can't help you? Larry said, I knew going into that law wouldn't help me, but I did it for other people. Because you can't imagine how many people are going through what I'm going through. As for now, the case remains open and it has been assigned to a special prosecutor. Although in the last report he released, he cites previous Facebook exchanges in which Molly mentioned suicide, as well as a lack of proof regarding a cover-up with a gun, Molly's phone, or anything else as reasons to conclude. Although this was a tragic end to a young lady's life, there is simply insufficient evidence at this time to charge anyone as accountable for murder. Charles Lamont said, it's not a case where you can put a bullet in his head and call it dead. It lives on, and it's going to live on until we get as much truth as we can. But there is one truth that Molly's family said they don't need the police to confirm. If she hadn't have met Richie Minton, this never would have happened, said Molly's sister Holly. I believe 100% that she would still be here today. At her funeral, I lost it, and I jumped on her casket, and my family had to carry me away, and he didn't even come. Is that what she meant to you? Nothing. She has one more message for the man that she believes took her sister's life. I would tell him, if I could look him in the face, one day my dad is coming for you. He's going to take you down. Just wait. Now, I was going to label this a murder-suicide case, and that's probably still what I'll put it under, except I 100% don't believe this was a suicide at all. First of all, based on the information that I looked at, she was shot twice, in the top of the head and on the left side. How? I mean, yes, people do live through gunshots to the head, but do you think she was coherent enough to shoot herself again? And with her left hand, even though she was right-handed, I feel like that would have been very difficult. No gunshot residue on her hands. I just don't think this was a suicide in any case. I think that I couldn't find any documents to prove that the roommate Wes was actually at work. And I think that the family is right. She went over there to help his drunken self, which I myself have done stupidly at 3 a.m. And they got into a fight. He attacked her. Maybe he was strangling her. I don't even know. And she was scratching him to get her off of him. Now, that's not to say she couldn't have scratched him under other means, which he would have been very smart to say that maybe they had intercourse and they got a little rough and she scratched him, because that would explain that. What it doesn't explain is the 2 other DNA profiles that were underneath her fingernails, and I would be quite curious to know if they were male, if they were tested against Wes, and if they've been run against anyone else's DNA. There's a lot of questions in this case that I myself would like answered that probably are never going to be. So I'm quite sorry to Molly's family that they have to go through this. I hope that I can bring a little attention to this case to maybe help push it a little further along. I know I'm just a small channel, but I always hope in missing persons cases, in cases like this, maybe I always feel like someone knows something, someone saw something, and